So it's time to make a video because of all the posts happening here around Easter um, and Christian Christological interpretations concerning Passover, where Iesous, is believed to have been this Passover Lamb or sacrificial lamb offering for sin. Um, anyway, it kind of begins. I'll just read some of this. The primary Bible verse identifying Jesus as the Lamb of God is John chapter 1, verse 29, where John the Baptist declares, "Behold, the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world." Um, so anyway, we're gonna have to look at that one line a bit more in a minute. This title highlights Jesus as the ultimate perfect sacrifice for sin, fulfilling the Old Testament sacrificial system. You know what? I can't wait. I've got to address this right now. Um, the Passover lamb was generally not considered a formal sin offering, chatat, in Jewish tradition, but rather a unique sacrifice of protection, redemption, and fellowship. While sin offerings were for atonement and dealing with specific transgressions, the Passover lamb's blood was a sign to protect the household from death, and its meat was eaten in a festive meal. And in fact, it says of the Passover that it's a memorial, not a sin offering. It's distinct from a sin offering. Passover lambs, Exodus 12, did not involve the same rituals as sin offerings in Leviticus 4 through 5. For example, placing blood on the altar horns. The lamb was eaten at home, whereas sin offerings were generally handled by priests in the sanctuary. Purpose: it was a celebratory meal and not a sign of the covenant. It signified redemption from slavery in Egypt, not specifically the forgiveness of sin. Alternative viewpoints: some Jewish traditions, such as the commentary from Rashi, and do see the blood as having an expiatory function, shielding households from divine wrath. In Christian interpretation in the New Testament, Jesus is identified as the Passover Lamb in 1 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 7, serving as a ultimate rather than an ultimate sacrifice that covers or removes sin. John chapter 1, verse 29. So see, that's Christianization. That's interpreting the whole thing Christologically when really this literature is written by Gentiles who just see a lamb and then they conflate the two types of lambs involved in Jewish history and ritual, turning the Passover lamb into a sin offering when it isn't. It's a memorial. In summary, while functionally related to salvation, and salvation in the Hebrew Tanakh is not going to heaven. It's being rescued from impending doom. That's what the Hebrew word Yeshua, I'm not saying the name Yeshua, that so-called Messianic Jews, most of whom are actually Gentiles, prefer to use for Iesous. Yeshua is a Hebrew word, and it means, you could say, salvation. I personally prefer the translation rescue, because when you read the passages in which it's used, it's describing rescue from impending doom. Like, for example, you're teetering on the edge of a precipice, and you could possibly fall over because you've lost your balance, but then you don't. You've been rescued from that danger. While functionally related to salvation, the Passover lamb is technically distinct from the prescribed technical sin offering in the Mosaic Law. So there's that. Basically, the Christian writers conflated the Passover lamb with the sin offering, so that you get John, who's supposed to be a learned Jew, performing baptisms in the same region as Ein Gedi and Qumran, and he says, "Behold the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world." Now, he could be here saying that he's the sin offering, not the Passover lamb. But Christians typically see Iesous as the Passover lamb. John chapter 1, verse 29, verse 36, John the Baptist calls Jesus the Lamb of God twice, making him as the sacrifice to remove sin. I just checked it. Yeah, good. Significance. Jesus is seen as the fulfillment of the Passover lamb in Exodus 12. Okay, these two are, again, the sin offering is not related to the Passover lamb. The book of Revelation, Jesus is portrayed 27 times as the lamb in Revelation, representing both a slain sacrifice and a triumphant reigning figure. So there's no question that Jesus is represented as a slain sacrifice. Contextual meaning. The title connects to the Jewish religious life where lambs were sacrificed for atonement. Substitution, like the Passover lamb, Jesus' death is interpreted as a protective saving act. See, protective as in like rescue, saving act, because the blood from the Passover lamb on, the lintels of the doorways of the homes of the Jewish people, or the children of Israel in Egypt, protected them from the messenger of death, the angel of death. So that's a protection, that's a rescue, that's not salvation that gets you into heaven. It's an earthly rescue. Revelation, albeit by a divine act, right? Revelation chapter 5, verse 6 depicts Jesus as a lamb standing as though it had been slain. Okay, so was he actually a slain sacrifice or not? A lamb standing as though it had been slain. Let's actually look at that to see what's going on there, because a few English words can really foul things up. We may have to look at different translations. And behold, and I beheld and look in the midst of the, let's go to the Revised Standard Version. And between the throne and the four living creatures and among the elders, I saw a lamb standing as though it had been slain. There it is, as though it had been slain. So, let's look at Bibles here. Stood a lamb as it had been slain. New King James Version, as though it had been slain. New Living Translation, as if it had been slaughtered. New International Version, looking as if it had been slain. So that's such strange wording. It's like, what are you trying to say? Are you trying to say it was all imagined? I mean, clearly we know that Christians imagined this, but is the book of Revelation trying to admit that it had been imagined? Um, as though it had been slain in the ESV. Uh, okay, how about Young's literal translation? A lamb hath stood as it had been slain. So I don't know, it's kind of fuzzy there. The language is fuzzy, and I'm not fluent in Greek, so I'm not going to pretend to figure that out. So, see back here. Others supporting verses highlighting this theme include 1 Peter chapter 1, 18 through 21, referring to the precious blood of Christ in Acts 8:32, which connects Jesus to the prophecy in Isaiah. So the Passover lamb was generally, oh, we already covered that. Yes, both the Passover lamb and animal sin offerings were required to be unblemished. So this is part of my point. Oh, but first I wanted to go back to, where did I put that? Here. So when Abraham is commanded to sacrifice his son, Christians make much about Genesis 22. But first, we should go to 22 verse 7. My father, and he said, here I am, my son. That's Isaac. He said, behold the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for a burnt offering? Abraham said, God will provide himself the lamb for a burnt offering, my son. So they went, both of them together. Then he bound his son Isaac, laid him on the altar. He was about to slay his son, but the messenger of Yud-He, Vav-He, called to him from heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham, and he said, here am I. He said, do not lay your hand on the lad or do anything to him, for now I know that you fear God, seeing you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. And Abraham lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, behind him was a ram caught in a thicket by his horns, and Abraham went and took the ram and offered it as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Christians make much of this because they say, look, it says that God will provide a lamb, and yet what was provided was a ram. Now, from the Jewish perspective, this is a lesson against human sacrifice. It's basically the Creator saying, look, I don't require human sacrifice like those other religions around you. But Christians then take it and twist it into a lesson about human sacrifice, about how Jesus, a man, would need to be sacrificed for, the whole world. So Gentiles being Gentiles, they take this passage and invert it once again so that it becomes a lesson for the idolatrous practices of the nation, where human sacrifice is something necessary to obtain favor with your God. So, and note that a ram, that's an older male sheep, not a young sheep like a lamb. So, there might be some meaning there. So back here, and So both the Passover lamb and the animal sin offerings were required to be unblemished or without defect. Exodus chapter 12, verse 5, and Leviticus chapter 4, verse 32. This requirement symbolized purity, perfection, and holiness, representing the best offering possible to God. Without blemish means the animal had no injuries, illnesses, or deformities. Key details: Passover lamb, required to be an unblemished male yearling, sheep or goat. The sin offering, animals including sheep, goats, bulls, for sin offerings, were likewise required to be perfect to represent the holiness of God and satisfy the need for a righteous sacrifice. Symbolism: these requirements point to the symbolic sinless perfection required to atone for sin. In Christian theology, this Old Testament so-called requirement is fulfilled in Jesus, who is depicted as the perfect, spotless sacrifice, in citing 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 19. So, let's look at that. Where it says, you know that you were ransomed from the futile ways inherited from your fathers, not with perishable things such as silver or gold, but with the precious blood of Christ, like that of a lamb without blemish or spot. Like that of a lamb, or the precious blood of Christ, the lamb without blemish or spot. So are we saying, it's kind of like a lamb without blemish or spot? It's not the lamb without blemish or spot. It's kind of like the lamb without blemish or spot. So where is the merit in it, or of your analogy or metaphor or whatever you want to call this weirdness of thinking that a human man is an animal? Where's the value in it if he's not actually the lamb, that he's only like that of a lamb without blemish or spot? And why might he need to say it that way? Well, it's because Iesous wasn't actually without blemish or spot. Iesous had wounds in his hands and feet. He had a spear in his side. I could cite the passages, but if you're a Christian, you should know them. You shouldn't need any scriptural proof of any of that. This is all common knowledge to anybody who's read the Gospels and who gets some kind of fetish satisfaction in this gore fest about persecuting a single Jewish man, right? Then Jesus is given a crown of thorns by Roman soldiers to mock his kingship, a scene detailed in Matthew chapter 27, verse 29, Mark 15, verse 17, and John chapter 19, verses 2 through 5. The events occur in Jerusalem, inside the governor's headquarters, the praetorium, just before his crucifixion. So now he's got a crown of thorns on his head. Now, should we imagine that these thorns aren't actually thorny, and that when someone puts the crown of thorns on his head, and I think some people even say that the Romans slapped it onto his head, that it didn't pierce his scalp and make him bleed, thus blemishing him? Key scriptural accounts: Matthew 27:29, soldiers twist thorns into a crown, place it on his head, put a reed in his hand, and mock him as king of the Jews. Mark chapter 15, verse 17, there's a similar account describing them dressing him in purple and crowning him. It's not really particularly relevant to his being blemished. John chapter 9 verses 2 through 5 specifically mentions the soldiers twisting the thorns and Pilate later presenting Jesus to the crowd wearing the crown saying, "Behold the man." Um, Jesus is also recorded as being whipped or scourged by the Romans just before his crucifixion. The primary explicit account is in John chapter 19 verse 1. Then Pilate took Jesus and had him flogged. Matthew chapter 7 verse 26 in the NIV. Then he released Barabbas to them, but he had Jesus flogged and handed him over to be crucified. So, I mean, this specifically mentions blemishing right before crucifixion, which is supposed to be the operation of sacrifice. Mark chapter 15, verse 15, the NIV. Wanting to satisfy the crowd, Pilate released Barabbas to them. He had Jesus flogged and handed him over to be crucified. See, the thing is that what Christians don't get because they haven't really they haven't either heard about the Caesar's Messiah thesis or the Flavian hypothesis is they don't, or they haven't understood it, is that they don't understand that it's kind of like how the elites operate these days. The Roman Flavians write this literature. They invent this Christian myth in such a way that they're practically begging the hearers and the readers to realize that it's all baloney. It's almost like they're trying to intellectually elevate these people. They're trying to almost put the intellects of the hearers and the readers through a sort of recruitment process. I don't want to say maybe I could say an initiation rite, kind of like an intellectual initiation rite, where only if they have the intellect to see what's being put on, to see the joke, do they then themselves ascend to the level of the intellectually elite who invented this myth. There are so many places in the Christian scriptures where if you actually ask questions and you investigate what's being asserted, you very quickly realize that it's the exact opposite of what the surface reading of the text is telling you. But most readers and most hearers, they trust the Christian scriptures to such a degree that they take everything it says at face value as if it's true, because and maybe because they also fear that if they question even a single thing about it, that they are testing God, or they're questioning God, or they're being unfaithful to God. Because the only thing they really know about worshiping God is what the Christian scriptures have told them. They're not very versed in the Torah, so they aren't able to see that the Christian scriptures often contradict God's law given through his servant Moses to the children of Israel, and via the children of Israel to all of mankind, albeit with fewer requirements. So, key details regarding the whipping. It was ordered by Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor. The method the Romans used a flagrum, a scourge, a whip with multiple leather thongs embedded with metal or bone designed to tear flesh. Okay, and torn flesh is, I'll look it up for you right now. Is torn meat kosher in Judaism? No, torn meat is generally not kosher. According to the Torah, Exodus chapter 22, verse 30, meat torn from a living animal or torn, injured in a way that would prevent it from surviving, known as terefa or treif, is forbidden. This includes animals attacked by predators, like Roman wolves, those with significant organ damage, or those like a spear in your side, or those improperly slaughtered, which makes the meat non-kosher. Okay? So, let's see, we'll continue. Number of lashes. The Bible does not state the exact number of lashes Jesus received. While Jewish law limited punishment to 39 lashes, I think it's termed 40 less 1. Roman scourging had no fixed limit. Prophecy. This event is considered a fulfillment of prophecies considered by Christians as fulfillment of prophecies, such as Isaiah chapter 50, verse 6, I offered my back to those who struck me, and Isaiah chapter 53, verse 5, by his stripes we are healed. Now, Christians being so eager to use this pesherist method of interpretation where you yank a proof text from its context and you interpret it in a Christological fashion where, a string of words randomly yanked from the Hebrew Tanakh becomes a prophecy for your false Messiah. They rarely see a mention of Jacob after Jacob's death as a literal reference to the so-called fleshly children of Israel, even though it is, and that's how it's understood in the Hebrew Tanakh. And they rarely consider that the prophets may have actually had lives, because so many of these later prophets, we do not read anything about their stories. All we have is this the product of their prophecy given through them, and so we never consider that some of the things in the prophecies might actually refer to the prophet themselves. We don't treat them like real people who had a life and had a story. So sometimes when the words of the prophets are self-referential, like they're referring to the prophet themselves, they have a tendency to see these as referring to Christ somehow. And that's what Christians do, is anytime they encounter a question mark in the text, they find something that they don't understand, they have a tendency to plug Jesus right into there, assuming it has a good connotation. If it has an evil connotation, they usually plug the Jewish people in there. And that's how they've been programmed by the Christian scriptures. So, location. The event likely occurred at the Praetorium, the governor's headquarters, as recorded in John chapter 19, verse 1, which also mentions the soldiers mocking him afterward. Iesous is recorded being struck, beaten with fists, or slapped in the face in several gospel accounts during his trials before the crucifixion. Key instances include being struck by a guard at Annas' house, John chapter 18, verse 22, being mocked and beaten with fists by guards in Matthew chapter 26, 67 through 68, and being beaten by soldiers in John chapter 19, verses 1 through 3. Specific Bible verses regarding Jesus being hit or punched. John chapter 18, verse 22, an officer strikes Jesus with his hand, or palms him, slaps him after Jesus answers the high priest. Matthew chapter 26, and by the way, that Jesus answers the high priest, this is in contradiction to the portrayal of Jesus as a lamb who was dumb or mute before his slaughterers, because there are instances where Jesus does respond to the people who are persecuting him and leading him to crucifixion. And then on the cross, or stauros, if you want to call it that, Iesous he's yapping while he's on the cross. He's talking to like the two guys next to him. So, yeah, not so dumb, not so mute, not so fulfilling of Christian messianic proof texts. Matthew chapter 26, verses 67 through 68. Soldiers and bystanders spit in his face and hit him with their fists, saying, "Prophesy to us, you Christ, who hit you." Mark chapter 14, verse 65. Some begin to spit on him and strike him with their fists, saying, "Prophesy." John chapter 19, verse 2. Roman soldiers repeatedly strike him in the face while mocking him as King of the Jews. Luke chapter 22, verses 63 through 64. The men guarding Jesus mock him and strike him. Now, I don't know if, some of these might just be parallelisms where you're getting different variants of the same event. That's a possibility. Nevertheless, the Gospels do portray Jesus as being punched and hit, even in the face. And what, are we supposed to believe that those left no bruises, no marks, no cuts, no blemishes? These events occurred during the tumultuous, unlawful trials before Caiaphas, Annas, and eventually Pontius Pilate. So then I ask, it's kind of strange how Christians, they engage in a lot of hand-wringing about all of this persecution done to this one Jew with whom they so supremely sympathize with, right? But then they have no sympathy for Torah-observant traditional Jews who are pictured as the enemy in the Christian scriptures. Now, lots of Christians will say, no, I support Israel, I love the Jewish people, but when it gets right down to it, it's not without preconditions. The love, it always comes with the precondition that there's the hope that they would convert to Christianity. You can see this for yourself by going to any Chabad house in the United States or abroad, and you will not see Christians there to actually learn about the Bible from a rabbi. You won't see it, and that's because the Christian scriptures have programmed them against the Pharisees from whom today's rabbis are descended. And it's also because the Christian scriptures have programmed them to see the Jewish people as descendants of the serpent, their father, the devil, etc. They see Jews as the enemy. They see no possibility of inspiration to be given to them from a traditional Jew. They don't see them as a source of inspiration. They see instead their Gentile pastor, who probably doesn't know Hebrew to the same degree that a 5-year-old traditional Jew does, right? They see more inspiration coming from that Gentile pastor than they do from the rabbi who could read the so-called Old Testament in its original language when he was 5 years old. That is the result of anti-Semitic programming that comes from the Christian scriptures. And it's also why they won't consider the Jewish perspective on this very twisted and strange idea that a man was an animal. Now you could say, oh, it was like an analogy, or it was a metaphor, or it was like fulfillment of prophecy, but not really, because he's not really a lamb, he's actually a man, but he's not actually a man, he's actually God. There's tons of logical contortionism going on in the Christian myth. And yet Christians continue to apologize for it to support something that has zero evidence, which is that Iesous is the Messiah. If he's the Messiah, why is he absent? Why is he tardy? Why did he not return in the first century when the disciples expected him to return? We know this because there's only 12 apostles. There aren't 12 perpetual apostolic offices that are constantly refilled upon the death of previous apostles. They expected him to return in the first century. Even so, you could say, well, no man knows the day or the hour of his return. Actually, if you look at Matthew chapter 24, they do know the day of his return. That's when Titus came with his legions. That's one of the ways that we know that Titus Flavius is actually the real Iesous. Iesous is a literary disguise for Titus Flavius. But never mind that. We could say no man knows the day or the hour, so then Christians think that they are duty-bound to wait on the curb for their date to show up. So they're standing on the curb all through the night, into the next morning, and the next day, and the next day, and they're still standing on the curb, waiting for the fulfillment of this Christian prophecy that he would return. But the Torah says, if someone presumptuously prophesies in the name of the Creator, and it doesn't come to pass, you shall not fear him. There's a positive commandment. You shall not fear that prophet. So when Iesous hasn't come, and it's 2,000 years down the road, Christians are still saying, well, no man knows the day or the hour, and I will continue to await his coming. So it could be 5 million years down the road, and according to that reasoning, Christians would still feel duty-bound to wait for his return. Meanwhile, life goes on here on earth. The Jewish people continue to live and thrive, but you think you are in the right, standing on the curb, waiting for your absent, tardy, and impotent king of the world. That's pure folly, especially when we know from the internal evidences now that the Roman Flavian dynasty cooked up this myth as the continuation of a physical war that they had executed against the Jewish people in Galilee and Judea, laying siege to Jerusalem, destroying the temple, thinking that that might actually destroy the Jewish people and Judaism and make them subject to Rome. And then when it didn't, oh, well, now we've got to continue this propaganda war against the Jews by cooking up this Christian myth against them and offering them this substitute Messiah. A Messiah which is no Messiah. A Messiah that is so little a Messiah that he needs Christians to defend his Messiahship. Why doesn't the Messiah defend his own Messiahship? It's like what the Romans cried when he was on the cross, right? If you be the Messiah, save yourself. Well, you know what? That's a really good question. If Jesus is really the Messiah, why doesn't he save himself and come back? Yeah, so this supposed lamb sacrifice that Iesous is thoroughly blemished in multiple ways. He's got the nail marks in his hands and his feet. He's got the spear in his side. He was scourged and flogged by the Romans, and it tore his flesh. He wore a crown of thorns that pierced his scalp. And he was repeatedly beaten, punched, and slapped in the face. He was thoroughly blemished. He was about as blemished as you could be. It's like they took a meat tenderizer to him. And yet this is supposed to be the unblemished lamb sacrifice for the sins of the world. It's a joke. It's a Roman joke put upon ignorant Gentiles by the Roman elites, the intellectual elite. It's time to wake up.